Chapter 9. Riding east from Dutch Springs, Pat Stevens pulled his horse up at the crossroads where he had sent the posse in the wrong direction earlier in the evening. He hesitated there for a long time, his face looking bleak and uncertain. He finally shook his head and turned his horse in the same direction the posse had ridden. His ranch lay along that road. It was too late now to hope to overtake Sam and Ezra on the southern road. Better to ride on home and change horses and prepare for a long trail ride. He knew where Sam and Ezra would head for. Just as well as though he were with them, he knew how their minds would work, the trails they would choose in riding south from Powder Valley. He could cut straight down across the country from the Lazy Mare Ranch, and it'd be a shorter ride than from here at the crossroads to a point where he could cross their trail. A lumpy moon was high in the heavens now, casting a golden glow down upon the peaceful valley, limiting remembered landmarks to Pat as he rode along at a slow lope. Everything that he saw in the bright moonlight, all the memories they brought to him, seemed to hold a special significance to Pat on this homeward ride tonight. For, though he refused to give it place in the forefront of his thoughts, there rode with him the realization that he might never look upon those familiar things again. He kept putting the thought away from him, but he could not put away the depressing mood that had gripped him. He wasn't sorry for what he had done in Kitty's room in the Jewel Hotel and in the back door of the bank building. He was merely sorry that it had been necessary for him to do those things at all. He didn't blame Sam or Ezra for what had happened. They too had become enmeshed in a tangle of circumstances that had been forced into them to act as they had. The dull rumble of many horses' hooves approached him from the road ahead, brought Pat's thoughts back to reality with a jerk. He straightened in the saddle, and his features set in grim lines as he realized that must be the posse returning from a hard and fruitless ride. He saw them soon in the moonlight, a close-packed group of riders, moving in a slow trot through with thoroughly winded horses. He pulled up in front of them and signaled out Mark Johnson to ask, "Any luck, Mark?"
"Not a damn bit, Pat. Didn't see hide nor hair of that critter, though we rode the legs off some of our horses. Are you sure he went that way, Pat?"
"I don't make many mistakes on a thing like that," Pat reminded him curtly.
"I know you don't." Johnson lifted his hat and doubtfully scratched his head. "Might have turned off someplace, I reckon. But we looked for sign and never saw none. What's doing back in town that's been keeping you from riding with us?"
"Plenty." Pat hesitated, reminding himself that they'd find out soon enough anyway. "2 killings."
"2 killings?"
The members of the posse began to cluster about him excitedly.
"Who was it, and how come, and who done it?"
"A dude from Denver. He got knifed in the Jewel Hotel, and Jeff Pardo. He got it while I had him locked up in the jail."
"You had Jeff Pardo locked up?"
"That's right. I ain't got time to explain it all now, though. I locked Jeff up because I figured he was on to doing something with the other killing."
"You reckon it was the same feller that held up the bank, Pat?"
"I ain't rightly sure, but I'm taking out after him. And you can tell the people in town that Pat Stevens promises them that he'll have the money stolen from that bank when he comes back."
"Do you got a line on him, Pat? You know where to go?"
"I have a line on him, and I'm going alone." Pat spurred his horse and slowly pushed through the group of riders. They didn't hold him back for any more questions. Pat Stevens' word was good with those men, and they were willing to let him ride on alone if that was the way he wanted it. Pat put his horse to a steady lope after he left the posse behind him. His body was slumped in the saddle, welded to the easy movement of his mount. He met no one along the road and held the same even pace until a light in the front window of his ranch house came into view. The sight of that lit window brought a lump into Pat Stevens' throat. It meant that Sally was waiting up for him, as she so often had for his return in the turbulent past. He dreaded what he had to tell her tonight. Not that Sally wouldn't understand, she always understood. That was what amazed and humbled Pat. In the past, he had made the mistake of trying to hide things from her, things that he thought a woman would be happier not knowing. Always, though, she managed to get the truth from him somehow, and it always ended in that he was glad that he told her. He slowed his horse to a trot and headed down past the big barn and corral to the unlit bunkhouse. Pat was not the kind of rancher who expected a hired man to care for his horse when he came in, but tonight was different. He had a lot of things to do, and he already wasted too much time. He swung off at the door at the bunkhouse and opened it and called in a low voice. "Anybody awake?"
"Yeah, is that you, boss?"
A young voice responded almost instantly. "Curly?"
"Yeah, that's me, Pat. Something wrong?"
"I've got some hard riding to do," Pat said quietly. "I wish you'd get up and give me a hand, Curly."
"You bet."
There was a creak of bed springs.
"What do you want I should do?"
"Unsaddle this horse, please, and then turn him into the corral. Then catch out that big roan in the corral."
"Big Red?" "Yeah, he ain't been rode for a week. You want him saddled?"
"Sure do, Curly. And could you pick out a good lead horse to go along? One that'll trail with a pack saddle and carry me if I have to change. Throw a pack saddle on him and tie on that bedroll that's behind my saddle. And then if you could, gather me up some camping stuff, Curly, a frying pan, a coffee pot, not too much, but enough to keep me going for a few days. I'll bring down some grub from the house and be ready to pull out in about half an hour."
"Look, boss, if you want some company."
"No, I'll be riding alone, Curly." Pat turned and walked from the bunkhouse and up the gentle slope leading to the pleasant ranch house which Sally had turned into a real home during the 10 years that they had lived there. Sally jumped up from the low rocking chair by the huge stone fireplace when Pat opened the door. She spilled some sewing out of her lap onto the floor, but disregarded it as she turned to smile at Pat. Her years of marriage had been kind to Sally Stevens. Her hair was still bright golden, and her eyes danced as eagerly at the sight of her husband as those of the young girl who might dance at the sight of her lover. Her face was unlined, a little fuller than when Pat first met her, and much, much more beautiful. The slim, girlish slenderness of her body had rounded into a soft maturity with the passing years, but her step was elastic as she came towards him, holding out both hands, and her voice was vibrant and strong.
"I almost went to sleep by the fire waiting for you, darling. What kept you so long in town?"
Pat tossed his hat onto the chair and caught up his wife in his arms. He put his cheek against her golden hair and muttered, "Gosh, you smell good, Sally. No perfume neither." She twisted away from him and laughed gaily.
"What would I want with perfume? Soap and water is just good enough for me."
"Some folks, they think they need perfume," he said, and then went past her to poke a smoldering log into flame on the big fireplace.
"I've got some hot cookies in the warming oven, and I can get a glass of cold milk. We'll have us a little party, darling, to celebrate you becoming a private citizen again."
Warming his hands over the fire, Pat replied, "Hot cookies would taste mighty good, Sally, but how about coffee instead of cold milk?"
"You know coffee keeps you awake, Pat."
Without turning from the fire, he replied gently, "That's why I want the coffee tonight, old lady." Sally paled a trifle and caught her under lip between white teeth. When Pat called her old lady in that gentle tone, she knew she was going to dread what he was going to tell her. She started to reply, and then, shook her bright head resolutely and said, "All right, I'll put the coffee pot on." She went into the kitchen quietly and began to put kindling on hot coals in the big wooden range. Pat waited until she had left the living room and then went through another door into the rear bedroom they occupied together and lifted his saddle gun in its leather boot down from the nail on the wall. He carried it back into the living room and pulled the short rifle from its leather sheath and examined the loading mechanism carefully when Sally re-entered the room. She stopped in the doorway, and her eyes filled with fright when she saw what her husband was doing. She hesitated a moment and then came forward with a forced smile upon her lips. "What is it, Pat? I thought you'd be done with night riding when you turned your sheriff badge over to Jeth Bordeaux." Satisfied that the carabine was in perfect condition, Pat resorted and restored it into the leather boot. "I still got my badge," he said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled it out and let his eyes brood down upon it. It seemed to him that it didn't shine nearly as bright as it had earlier in the evening, as though the insolent metal itself had somehow become tarnished by what he had done that night. Sally's eyes dilated when she saw the badge, and she asked sharply, "Why didn't you give it to Jeth, as you planned?" Jeth Bordeaux was dead. He slowly slid the badge back into his pocket. "Dead?" Sally reached out to catch hold of his arm. "Tell me, Pat. Something dreadful has happened." "It's pretty bad," he nodded. "Wait till you bring the coffee and cookies in, Sally, then I'll tell you all about it when we're settled down." As she turned to go back into the kitchen, he raised his voice to add, "You might want to get a little chuck together, old lady. A piece of sow belly and some beans. Coffee, flour, and sugar, enough to last a couple days, maybe." "All right, Pat." And her voice did not falter, though she was amazed to find she could speak past the burning lump that was choking her throat. Pat sat down at a small table in front of the fireplace and pulled up the right leg of his pants above the top of his boot. He reached inside and drew out the knife that had murdered Fred Ralston, laid it on the table, and unrolled it from its towel wrapping. The firelight glinted evilly upon the red stains of the dead man's blood on the sharp blade. He stared at the knife for a moment, and then pushed it back, leaving it in plain sight on top of the towel. Sally came hurried in with a platter of sugar cookies, and as she placed them in front of Pat, she gave a horrified exclamation. "Why, that's Sam's hunting knife. It's all covered with blood." "That's part of what I got to tell you, Sally." He picked up a warm sugar cookie and bit into it. Sally went slowly back to the kitchen without asking any questions. Pat thoughtfully munched on the cookie and licked the crumbs from his lips and then turned to stare into the firelight while he rolled a cigarette. He could hear Sally moving around briskly in the kitchen, getting together the few necessities that he would need for a few nights' pack trip. She came in presently and set a partially filled gunny sack down near the front door, and she said composedly, "There's all the things you'll need," and then went back to the kitchen. When she returned next time, she brought 2 cups, a big iron coffee pot with her. The pot was steaming and exuding the odor of strong coffee. She filled 2 cups and set the pot down on the hearth near the coals to keep it warm, and then sat down opposite Pat and said, "You better tell me all about it." "Well, it all started when a dude got off the evening stage from Denver." Pat took a sip of hot coffee, and then went on with a straightforward and completely truthful account of the evening events, omitting none of the facts, offering no excuse for his own conduct, and laying the entire affair in front of his wife of her own clear judgment. Sally listened to him without comment. She sat very still for a full minute after he finished, and then she said softly, "Poor Sam. And Ezra." I've got to go after them, Sally.
To arrest Sam for killing a man when you can see that it's a put-up job?
Well, not that so much, Sally. There's the money that they stole from the bank.
Are you sure it was Ezra you saw? It was dark in the bank. Perhaps you were mistaken?
No, it was Ezra, that darn crazy galoot, Pat went on angrily. What'd he do that for? Stealing money that you and me and all the rest of the folks in the valley had trusted to the bank. He shouldn't have done that.
He was bewildered and frightened, Pat. You know how Ezra is. He was dead set on getting Sam out of danger. And I suppose their money was in the bank too. He didn't want to go off and leave that.
I've got to go get it back, Pat told her heavily. I just the same as helped in stealing when I shot over Ezra's head to warn him as so he could get away. And then I sent the posse scooting off on the wrong road. But I don't see what else I could have done, Sally. I couldn't let him get caught robbing the bank. Not with that dead man back there too. I had to help him get away, and now I got to go get that money back.
Do you think they killed Jeff as well?
I don't rightly know, Pat confessed. I don't know what to think. They might have. You know how that red-headed Ezra is when he gets riled up. What do you make of it, Sally? What do you reckon Ralston was planning with Kitty and Perdot when he came into town? I just don't understand it myself.
At least you know it was some scheme to get Sam and Ezra's money from them, she told him with spirit. Whatever it was, Sam must have seen through it, and he and Ralston got into a fight, and then Sam killed him.
Well, that's not the way that Kitty told it.
Kitty! Sally laughed scornfully and tossed her bright head. That woman? Do you think the truth could be in a woman like that?
You don't know her, Sally.
I know her kind, singing and dancing in the saloon with men.
I don't know. I'd like you to meet her. Damned if I don't feel sorry for her.
You men are all alike. Just because a woman's pretty and goes around half naked.
Well, if it was like you think, Pat argued. If they were trying to get Sam's money and he killed Ralston for that, why did Ezra get him out of town so fast and rob the bank to boot? Why didn't they just stay and tell the truth? No jury would blame Sam for killing a man that way. Sally wrinkled her smooth forehead and shook her head.
I don't know, except that you know Ezra isn't terribly bright, and if Sam did pass out like Kitty said, that must be it, Pat, don't you see? Ezra wasn't in there. He didn't know what happened, only what Kitty told him. And she made it look bad for Sam and told Ezra her husband had come in and caught them together and Sam had murdered him in cold blood. Not knowing anything about what the fight was really about, Ezra believed her.
Yeah, Pat agreed thoughtfully. Well, that could be it, all right, but what about Jeff? Shooting him that way through the jail window, that looks pretty darn bad.
I don't know, but I bet there's some explanation, Sally said stoutly. You'll find out when you talk with them.
I hope so. Pat finished his cup of coffee and cleared his throat. You know, if there isn't some good explanation like that, I won't be riding back this way, honey.
You won't be riding back home? She choked out.
How can I, honey? I'm not going to bring 'em back if it means hanging. You know I can't do that, not to Sam and Ezra.
No, I guess not, she whispered.
You know not, Sally. I can't judge my friends. If it means them taking the Owl Hoot trail, well, I reckon it's the same for me.
But why, Pat? Why couldn't you come back?
Because I'd never be able to look any man in Powder Valley in the face again. You can see that, Sally. I'm sheriff. If I let a murderer go because he's my friend, I'm just as guilty as him.
But what about the bank money? You said you'll get it back?
And I will. I'll find a way to send it if things turn out wrong. I'm sorry, honey, but that's the way it looks to me. Pat's voice wasn't very steady. Sally got up, poured more coffee. Her eyes shone softly in the firelight.
Before I ever married you, she reminded him, I chose to go with you when it looked like you were turning against the law. Things haven't changed any since then, except that I guess I love you even more.
Pat choked over a sip of hot coffee. You mean?
I mean that I'll join you wherever you go, she told him steadily. You have to do what you think is right, and I want you to, but... Oh, isn't this dreadful, Pat? And Sam was beginning to get his new job tomorrow, wasn't he? Riding that Pony Express mail route.
Yeah, Sam was looking forward to that like a kid at Christmas time. Pat turned the coffee cup round and round his hands, and he kept his eyes lowered. There's one other thing I haven't told you yet. I got sort of a clue. I reckon you could maybe call it that.
A clue? What kind?
Pat reached into his jacket pocket and awkwardly drew out the upper length of a white listle stocking. He blushed as he dropped it on the table in front of his wife. See what you make of that.
Why, it's a stocking, part of one, and it's beautiful.
Sally's finger caressed the soft, sheer material.
Where'd you get it, Pat?
In Miss Kitty's room.
Oh, it's hers, but why is part of it cut off?
That's what I was wondering, Pat mumbled. Thought maybe you'd know why a woman would cut the foot off a pretty stocking like that. Sally's fingers continued to caress the material.
I never had a nice one like this. If I did have one, I certainly wouldn't want it cut up. They cost an awful lot, Pat. I've seen what they cost in the mail-order catalogs.
Well, the mate to this one was in her drawer, Pat told her, his face reddening again. The bottom part of her dresser. He added hastily as if that was important. It wasn't hurt a bit. Sally shook her head, looked mystified.
I don't see what kind of clue that is.
I don't either. Not yet, anyway. Pat got up and picked up his rifle. He tried to be as casually as he could. Well, old lady, I guess I'd best be moseying along. When Doc wakes up in the morning, tell him about hunting bank robbers. No need for him to know the truth. Yet.
I'll tell him,
Sally promised in a steady voice. She got up and took her husband's arm and walked to the door with him.
You taking a pack horse?
Yep. Curly's getting him packed up now. Pat stooped and picked up the gunny sack of food that Sally had fixed for him to take along. I'll let you know as soon as I can, he promised. Sally stood on her tiptoes and put her soft, rounded arms about his neck. She smiled into his eyes and pressed her lips against his.
Fix a place for me, Pat, if you don't come back.
Her voice was almost inaudible. I will, honey. His arm tightened about her briefly. Then he turned and walked down to the corral. Sally leaned against the door frame and watched his tall figure disappear into the misty moonlight. Tears ran unchecked down her cheeks now. She didn't care. Once more, she was trumped, sending Pat out into danger with a smile and a kiss, holding back the tears until he could no longer see her. End of chapter 9.